Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator and coach, Sasha Thompson.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. We're going to talk about inclusive leadership today, but not just as a theory. Like, what does it look like in practice? And especially during times like this, where diversity, equity, and inclusion are under attack, more and more leaders are taking up the mantle or wanting to take up the mantle in figuring out how do we continue to move this work forward if there's not a diversity, equity, and inclusion person in charge, if there's no chief diversity officer. What does this look like? Because we are seeing the impacts, the positive impacts of this, and we know we need to move this forward. And so today, my guest is Dr. Eddie Pate. I'm going to use the title, who is a consultant and practitioner in this space, who's been doing this work for a very long time. In corporate and again, as a consultant. And so really looking forward to this conversation. So Eddie, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It is an honor to be here, and it's lovely to be sitting across from you again and seeing your smiling face.
Thank you. So for those who may not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about you and how you got into this work?
Sure, absolutely. So as you said, I've been doing this kind of a long time. So I've been doing inclusion, diversity, and equity work for about 25 years, going on 25 years now. And it started way back in 2000 when I started at Microsoft, and I had gigs at Microsoft, Starbucks, a company called Avanade, where I was the VP of diversity there. And my corporate career culminated at Amazon, where I was director of inclusion, diversity, and equity for worldwide operations. And as I like to joke with people, I had 18 people on my team, and we had just a small little responsibility, about 1 million people at any given one time. So it's kind of crazy to think about. I got my doctorate from the University of Washington in comparative race and ethnic relations and social psych, the sociology piece of it. And I think this is really, that PhD was kind of a culmination of me running towards fairness, if you will. And that's how I got into this work. I really wanted to do something where I can have an impact on what we didn't call it equity back then, but really that's what I was thinking about, right? It's fairness. I wanted people to be treated well. I wanted people to have access. And this was just a natural feeling, a natural fit for me because of that academic background, the fact that I'm biracial, and my parents were married at a time before it was even legal to be married, since my dad is black, and my mom was as white and blue-eyed as you can get because she was from Niederfischbach, Germany. So it's that kind of thing. So it's growing up with those experiences, getting a PhD, running towards fairness. Next thing you know, it's almost 25 years of doing ID&E work.
Yeah, I love it. And, the sociologist in me, I was a sociology major. So I totally connect and get that. That is where I started my love of learning about different people and cultures and understanding how we experience this space that we're all in, but very differently. And so that kind of helped open the doors for me. So I appreciate that piece of it. So a lot of the work you do now is really focused on inclusive leadership. How do you define inclusive leadership? Because I know, I talk about it a lot and have some definitions, but I would love to hear from you and your perspective.
So, for me, inclusive leadership it's hard to capture in just one definition, and if I'm honest, right? But there are some characteristics and principles and notions that goes into being an inclusive leader and leading inclusively, right? And the thing that you just talked about, where you talked about, wanting to embrace and understand differences and being culturally competent. So an inclusive leader for me is someone who is driven to really want to understand cultural differences and position themselves and others to understand their experiences and, what their lives are about, what their cultural differences are, what drives them. So inclusive leaders are driven by cultural competence, but inclusive leaders are also driven by the whole understanding and notion that who they are, how they lead, how they empower people, how they reprimand people, how they encourage people, promote people, is all with an understanding that they have to be careful that they understand there are multiple ways to do it. So I tell people to think about ethnocentrism, right? We all are ethnocentric in how we approach life, and characteristics or insights of being an inclusive leader is you have to understand your own ethnocentrism, which is people tend to judge others based off of our own culture, our background, the way of doing things. And we see our way as the best way to do it. And people who are inclusive leaders understand that dynamic and understand the value of ethnocentrism and the problem with ethnocentrism. So you have those kinds of dynamics. But I also see inclusive leadership as people who understand the value of vulnerability and empathy and caring in the leadership framework, right? It's the wisdom of knowing that unconscious biases, stereotypes drive us as humans and drive us as inclusive leaders. So rationalizing, understanding our unconscious biases, our stereotypic perceptions we have, all that tie into whether we're a strong inclusive leader. And then I think finally what I'll say and is there are a few other things that I think inclusive leaders need to understand. One of the things that I love is the whole notion of being a tempered radical. So for me, an inclusive leader's characteristic is tied into being a tempered radical, and that's Deborah Meyerson. Is an incredible sociologist, a professor out of California, out of Stanford, and she talks about being inclusive leaders. And she's written a book called Tempered Radicals. And so it's a great book, and it's also called Rocking the Boat. She had to change the title since the book named Tempered Radical came out right around 9/11, and there was a lot of blowback when people did that. So and she has two principles in there I think that are really important for the question you asked me. A tempered radical is someone who rocks the boat and rocks it hard, but keeps themselves and others in the boat, because you can't affect change if you're not in the boat. And then the other piece that they do, and it really ties into my book, and you can see how this flow works, an inclusive leader understands the power of dropping a pebble, which causes a ripple, which causes someone else to drop a pebble, which causes a ripple, which causes someone else to drop a pebble, which causes a ripple, and so on. All those pebbles or little, small, inclusive daily practices or actions can actually lead to sustainable, systemic and cultural change. So inclusive leaders understand the value of those daily practices and how to create accountability for them, how to encourage and motivate people for them. So there's a lot that goes into inclusive leadership. Clearly, this is something I'm super passionate about, but that's a long-winded response. But
that was great. I mean, two things that really stood out for me in that was one, connecting to humanity, right? And getting to know and understand, the cultural nuances of who we are and how we are. Is you can't just paint a brush across and say, okay, I'm going to treat everyone the same, because we're not the same. And so it's tapping into the humanity of who we are and getting to know people, which I think a lot of leaders, unfortunately, in this day and time are afraid to do, which ties into that empathy, which ties into that vulnerability, which ties into, oh, I might actually start to care about this person, right? That's on the other side of this. The other thing that, I kind of wrote down as you were talking about the tempered radical was it is the ripple effect, right? And so what immediately came to mind was the power of one. It does not have to be a systemic change, right, in order for you to be an inclusive leader. You do not need permission to do that. But how you show up every single day as a leader, that then becomes that ripple effect. But then also,
big ripple.
You model the behavior that you want to see, right? And
absolutely.
You start to emulate. Oh, I see how Eddie's showing up. Let me try to do that because I see the results from that. How do you? I'm gonna say this in an interesting way. how do you get folks out of their own way? Right? Because I think
right.
people are afraid to say or do the wrong thing. And so therefore they
Right.
freeze, they don't do anything.
Right.
How do you start to get them to think about, how do I want to show up as a leader inclusively in this space? And what are some of those small things that they can do that aren't overwhelming?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll tie in really quickly what you just said. Part of the principle of daily practices and creating cultures of belonging that I talk about is that if you do it right, doing ID&E is not overwhelming at all. In fact, it's empowering. But you've got to do the work. To your point that you're making is how do you become comfortable enough with being an inclusive leader? Very first thing is, like I said earlier, don't be afraid to be vulnerable. You don't have to be perfect. You have to be willing to listen and learn and take feedback. And I often say that some of the best thing about becoming prepared to be an inclusive leader is how well do you listen? How well are you willing to hear what someone's telling you who is very distinctly different from you, and that may have a different story that you need to understand and center as opposed to your own story. So that's part of it is you learn to just kind of almost take your badge and your level and everything off and be willing to be vulnerable and to listen and to hear, right? Is part of how you be prepared. But there's nothing that can replace being culturally competent and working towards it. So if you really want to feel much better about being an inclusive leader and having an impact and understanding how to drop pebbles, you need to understand how ID&E is and manifests for you personally. So I talk to people all the time. One of the best pebbles you could drop is owning this topic. So what time are you taking to make sure you understand what's your thoughts about diversity? What's your intersectionality? How do you come across the people? You know, do you label yourself? Do you say, I'm white, I'm male, I'm heterosexual, I'm from the Midwest, I went to this school, all these things, because how you draw your intersectionality is how you perceive and experience life and how people perceive you. And understanding what that means at each of those intersections matters. So that's what inclusive leaders need to do as well, is own this topic and to be willing to be culturally competent and start working towards it, right? I think that's going to be very important for them to be able to do that. And then understand those other dynamics that we've talked about. Understand how unconscious bias plays for you, your stereotypes, your cultural background, and that kind of thing. And then be willing to be empathetic and listen. So, and then what I tell people is, this is an ongoing journey. This is not something that you're suddenly an inclusive leader and suddenly prepared to do it, right? You got to keep growing, and there are going to be paths that you take off of your journey and you get back on. There are going to be mistakes that you make, and you've got to be willing to say, you know what? And this is one of the things we talk about in my book. This is a pebble you could drop. This is a daily practice, is understanding the difference, the intent versus impact quotient. Right. So there are going to be times when you are trying to have a particular effect or action or something. You say something, you're engaging with a group who's maybe different from you, a group of Black women who are part of an employee resource group or something, and you're male or white or Asian or something like this. And you have an interaction that doesn't go like you expected it to go. And right then, instead of just ignoring and plowing through, this is what inclusive leaders do. And this is what prepares you for the next time you have that engagement, is to say, hold on a second. I'm gonna hit the pause button for a second. What I said and did clearly didn't have the impact I had. And I heard murmurs and I saw faces. Please help me understand that intent versus impact that didn't happen how I expected it, so that I can learn as someone who's part of the majority population or what. So you can see there that I've modeled what I think inclusive leaders need to do in order to take another step down on their journey. So there are a lot of things to do, I think, to get prepared, but are you owning it? Are you really understanding your own impact in engagements? And then here's the other thing. Are you a tempered radical? Are you willing to rock boats? Right? Are you willing to drop pebbles and sometimes put your own career at risk because you want to do what's right, not what's expected? Yeah. And so these are the kinds of things that I talk to people about and in preparation. So we can talk about more of the pebbles in other questions. Does that make sense?
That makes absolute sense. And I'm kind of chuckling because, when the whole rock the boat, what went through my mind was, I'm going to ask everybody in that boat, can you swim?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to rock, and I'm going to rock it, and we might flip over, but as long as you know how to get back in the boat, we're good.
Sasha, let me jump in really quickly. What you just triggered in me was a quick story I'll tell. So I was talking to the National Association for African Americans in HR way back in like 2002, 3 or 4, something like back in then, after Deborah's book had come out. And I was talking to them about being a tempered radical and rocking boats and rocking it hard, but keeping yourself in. It was not a nanosecond when I stopped talking that people shot their hands up in the audience and said, I hear you, but brother, every once in a while, you got to rock their butts out of the boat. Now, I didn't say the word they said, but I didn't want to be censored and have to be beeped over. But you got to rock.
No beeping.
No beeping. You got to sometimes you got to knock their asses out of the boat and yourself, because it is that important or is that egregious, and you really want to make a statement. And so you're absolutely right. And I do always give that caveat when I do trainings and talk to leaders about rocking boats. There are times you have to be willing to do this. And in my book, and even in my book, I talk about a couple situations where, more than a couple, over the course of my career, where I just rocked the boat and rocked it hard without regard whether I'd be in it, because it was that important. Yeah. So that is a great call out. That's why I had to stop for a second. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'm a boat rocker.
Yes, you are.
One of the other things that you spoke about just now was that need to be kind of reflective, and not so much in those words, but that's what came to me, because I often talk about, like, have you done the work on yourself before you even try to do this work? And I think that there's so many people that have good intentions, but have not done their own internal work to not only understand their identities, but how those identities shape how they see the world. Yes. How those identities shape their expectations.
Yes.
How those identities may have been wrong.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so are you willing to address some of those things that may be challenging or battling within you? Correct. Before you even start to do this work. And I think that that's a very difficult thing for people to do, because no one wants to say they were raised wrong, right?
Right. Absolutely.
You can always say, I was raised the best way that my parents or my family knew how to raise me, but I have learned something else, or I've learned something different that has reshaped how I see the world. And so when I hear you talking, it really is how many people are taking that time to be introspective and really understand who they are, but why are they even wanting to do this work?
Right. It's super critical. And as you just talked about, I think people truly need to understand their intersectionality. They need to understand who they are and how they come across to others and how people perceive them. I think that's super important, right? But also, I think another thing that I often talk about is this whole notion, and this ties in exactly with what you were saying. People were raised to treat people how they want to be treated, right? How often have you heard the golden rule, right? As people talk about the golden rule. But what you're talking about, and you're getting at beautifully, Sasha, is it actually shouldn't be the golden rule, should be the platinum rule. And so I talk to people all the time about treating others how they want to be treated. And so that one fundamental mental shift, just imagine the impact if we had droves of leaders suddenly treating people how they want to be treated, not how you want to be treated. It changes the dynamic of the workplace completely, right? Yeah. It could be potentially just mind-blowing, and organizationally, you change from suddenly being kind of this fit-centered kind of environment and organization to and a cultural fit, as opposed to cultural ad. And all of a sudden you start switching into this cultural ad kind of framework. And one other thing that this does for us, which is super interesting with the reflection piece, if you're not reflecting on who you are and thinking about empathy and being empathetic for others and be curious and listen to and understand the stories and realities of people who walk different paths, right? That's empathy. And here's the key for your audience and we're talking to. If you want to lead inclusively and be an inclusive leader, like you asked me earlier, if you have not reflected on and wrestled with your sense of empathy, that you're not going to lead inclusively, because empathy is the pathway to inclusive leadership. Inclusive leadership is what is needed in order to have the types of inclusive activities, events, structures, process mechanisms that lead to belonging. Everyone talks about belonging right now, and how you get there is starting through empathy, reflection, and leaders leading in a way that creates the kind of culture that is speak up cultures, cultures,
Right.
where inclusive leadership is valued, where vulnerability is valued, where curiosity is valued, and that's the pathway to belonging. And so that is what I think people need to understand, right? And you are so spot on when you talk about this notion of reflection, and it's like you're looking at all my slide decks that I do for all my presentations, right?
Yes.
I have a reflection slide at the very beginning, right off the bat, right? Saying, excuse the baseball analogy, right at the very beginning, right? Yep. Is I just tell people, let's reflect on, what does it mean to be an inclusive leader? What does it mean to lead? How does vulnerability play into this? And sometimes you stump them, you know? Wow. Yeah, right. And you're just like, yes. And sometimes you just like, no, I get this. And you can really hear it when someone has, because they're using words like vulnerable, listening, and not treating everyone the same. Equity is important, not equality or equal opportunity, which sounds wrong, right? People are like, what do you mean equal opportunity and equality, or not? Because equality says we treat people exactly the same. And equal opportunity says, I'm colorblind, I'm race blind, sex blind. Everyone has equal access. Go get it. The best will rise to the top. We know that it's so much more complex than that.
Yeah.
Equity is about fairness, and not fairness that everyone gets the same thing to be successful, but you get what you need to be successful.
What you need. Absolutely.
Exactly. There you go.
You're reading my slides now. But one of the things that you said that really stood out for me, it kind of triggered for me, was that, the platinum rule. And for some of my coaching clients, what I've said to them, and it's a question that stomps almost every single one of them, is, what if this is not about you?
Right. Yeah. Isn't that funny?
Right. Like, what if none of this is about you? Like, how you are seeing the world. This isn't about you. This is how other people are experiencing it. Right. And so how does that shift how you would move forward? And it's one of those stumpers where it's like, wait a minute. You have to think about it from other people's perspectives, right? So again, that's that empathy. Absolutely. That's that vulnerability. That's that understanding of, oh, okay, not everyone is seeing the world the same way that I do.
Right.
And I appreciate you talking about kind of, starting your sessions in that way. And I'm sure you're familiar with the identity iceberg. And I often will throw that up, and I'm like, okay, pick your top 5. And that's the number one thing that'll stomp people. Like, wait a minute, I have to pick 5 of these, because they've never thought about more than maybe 1 or 2.
Right.
And then we have conversation around, okay, so if religion is a top one for you, if this person is Christian and this person is Muslim,
right,
what does that look like?
Right, exactly.
It's both of your top 5s. Right. So that doesn't mean you're necessarily seeing things the same way either. And so it leads to great conversation. But that's what this is. It's the unpacking of identity, the unpacking of how we see the world, having leaders take that time to realize, okay, not everyone, just because we're in the same, and I say this all the time, just because we're in the same place doesn't mean that we got here the same way.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
And so what does that mean for me as a leader, and how do I need to move? How do I give people equity, right? How do I give people what they need in order to be successful, and not just everyone gets the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And something you said too is it makes for the conversation to be a better conversation, but you've got to want and understand that the conversation needs to happen.
Yeah.
And part of the conversation is something that you and I have talked about before too. Part of the reality of empathy and understanding others is reflecting enough on yourself to call out your privilege, to call out your, in some situations, your maleness or your whiteness, or depending on where you are in the world. Let's take this global. It's not always going to be about race.
Right.
The cultural differences. You could be in Japan, where it's very monoracial society, but it's very multicultural society, and you have various folks from different parts of Asia that are there that have very stark cultural differences. And because of those cultural differences, the way humans are, you got to find a way to level up on somebody, right? So, so you're in a society where gender and cultural background makes a huge difference. And this conversation that you were talking about, one of the things that I had to deal with when I ran ID&E for Worldwide Ops at Amazon was in Japan, was dealing with Japanese managers and workers who were being managed by Vietnamese or Korean or Chinese women. That was the battleground. Here in the US or in South Africa, you may have, it being more defined around race lines, but you're going to be in other parts of the world, it's going to be defined about culture. And how you have that conversation embedded in the culture that has raised you is what makes you a good inclusive leader, when you recognize it, when you atone to it, when you say, this matters for how I'm viewed, where I am. And even though I'm painfully taught in this country not to talk about privilege and around whiteness, because then it challenges meritocracy, and you can't have that. Right?
Of course not. No.
So of course, you can't have that. So it is, when you have finally gotten to the point where you can evolve to having those true reflections, those true understandings, that's when the conversation works.
Yeah. And I appreciate you making that global, because this is not just a US issue. And I think that so many people feel this is just a US issue. It is not, that same place where I worked, where you worked, we worked.
Yes.
But we were having some of those conversations and issues around, okay, how do we have this conversation in France?
Yeah.
How do we have this conversation in Mexico? How do we have this conversation? Like, we went to South Africa and I'm looking at forms and people are like, Sasha, there's colored on the forms. Let's talk about the culture, right? Like, it's a different culture than the US. And so being an inclusive leader, especially if you are leading a global team, it should be this, like, the number one priority of what your competencies that you should have. The other thing you mentioned just now, and I want to go back to it a bit, is, with this anti-inclusion diversity effort that's taking place, there's this push for, well, first of all, the acronym has become another word for Black, but
that's the problem, and that's part of the problem,
right?
That's part of the problem.
But there's this push for, well, we don't want to see color, we don't want to see race or ethnicity or gender, and so by doing that, there's this sense that there will be meritocracy. We know that is not true. That is not accurate. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the diversity iceberg, right? Every single one of us, right, has some identity that is based in race and gender and sexual orientation and, religion and all of these things. And so when you try to make it race neutral, it's a disservice to everyone. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely can. And in fact, if you think about the arguments that people have now that are anti-ID&E or DEI, as people like to say it, even if you go back to the basis for our very ultra conservative Supreme Court throwing out affirmative action at higher education, it was rooted in the very thing you're talking about, which is the notion of being colorblind, race blind, disability blind. And it's wrapped into that's equal opportunity, right? And and with the perception that we have spent enough time making accommodations for people, the playing fields are level. race no longer matters, gender no longer matters, economic status no longer matters, educational attainment no longer matters. It's a level playing field, and the best will rise to the top. We've gotten to that point. They throw up this false argument that called reverse discrimination. We're discriminating against a whole group by giving people simply access, not advantage. So I want to say that loud and clear.
Right.
We're giving people access, not advantage, to structures and processes, institutions that they've been historically denied and continue to be so. But people, like I said earlier, they don't want to acknowledge their privilege, because once they acknowledge their privilege, then this whole notion of meritocracy is false. Meritocracy is the belief that what you earn is based off your talents only, no advantage. If you work hard, you will be successful. And what you see rising to the top are the ones who have worked hardest to get there, and they haven't had help, right? So, that's the problem, right? That's the problem we sit in. And it also ties into, as a fellow sociologist, you'll appreciate this too, is the whole in-group, out-group dynamic, right? And that's why we're seeing what we see today, right? Too, is it's been justified to have a very deep sense of in-group versus out-group. And here's where the rub happens, in my opinion. When the out-group starts making gains on the in-group, you always see some type of backlash. Yeah. And we're in the midst of a cycle of backlash, because that's why you hear people say replacement theory, attack on affirmative action, and all these perceptions that people are getting handouts or advantages when, I work very hard. I'm not going to get promoted anymore. I'm not going to get a job. But it is so laughable to think about the reverse discrimination thing, because it doesn't happen. If you look at the data and numbers, never in my 25 years of working across corporate have I seen, men or white men or people in positions, majority positions, not being promoted or hired or given plum jobs. It just hasn't. It's been a battle to create access for other people, right? And so when you have, so I'll flip back to this one. So when you have this battle between groups, and you see a group making gains, and that's what you saw after George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. You suddenly saw money going into ID&E efforts. You saw people attacking structural differences, not just individual differences, because that you won't be successful until you change process and structures and policies. So you suddenly have a backlash because people were making all these gains. And when you have a backlash, this is what happens. You have people come to the forefront to challenge you in court. You legitimize racist, sexist, homophobic, discriminatory discussion, all in the idea of maintaining in group versus out group, and making sure that you get yours, you're not replaced. And people buy it, and they buy it hook, line, and sinker, which is super interesting. So that's what we're seeing. Right. That's what we see. The backlash is people are afraid of losing what they have. And here's the last thing I'll say on this topic. They are also afraid of losing the power that they have.
That part.
It is critical. And because you have a lot of smart people who see data, they understand trends, and they know darn well women still make 20 cents less on the dollar. Black women make 60 cents on every dollar, right? Whatever. So, 40, right? So you still see the data, anecdotal, qualitative, quantitative, points to a real entrenched structural gap that is not breaking down like people are saying. So they know it. So what they're doing is holding on to power, and that's what they're doing. That's my opinion.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's like the greatest example right now that came to my mind was the Fearless Fund, right? Which was created because women get less than 1%, women of color get less than 1%, right, of funds. The word just went out of my head.
No.
So they're being
investment funds for them to go. Yeah.
And I'm just like, okay, so we can't even get 1%. Like that's a threat. That if we had 1%, because that's what the Fearless Fund is trying to do, is like, okay, we need to just increase. And that's what it is. It's very interesting to me that also that organization has been attacked, yet there are other organizations that do the same thing that are not run by women of color, by Black women, that are not being attacked. Especially with, was it Dr. Claudine Gay and what was happening? Black women have been attacked in many of these organizations. And I was speaking to a professor not too long ago who was saying, it's very fascinating to me that me as a white man doing diversity work in the School of Education, I'm just now getting 1 or 2 questions into my work. I'm not being attacked.
Right.
And so it's understanding this is the system, right? This is what it looks like when there is a threat to power, and they'll go after the ones that they think they can actually do something and get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's an interesting thing. We always talk about that women of color get less than 1% of venture. And I'm blanking on the term too. It's venture capital, right?
Yeah,
I think it's what we're talking about, venture capital. Less than 1%. But people don't talk about flip it around. We're not talking about the 99%.
Right.
Of what's being given to people who are they're prototyped, quite frankly. Men get disproportionate amounts. White people in our country at least get disproportionate amounts. And it's no knock to the hard work they're trying to do and everything. It is simply we don't point out our privilege because we're painfully taught not to talk about our privilege because it challenges it being meritocratic.
Yeah.
Right? If it was truly a meritocratic process, you would, because if you look at the number of small minority-owned businesses are some of the fastest growing attempts to create businesses in the country, but by Black women and Black men and Indigenous people and Latinos and every. So they're working super hard to do this. And if it were based off of a fair, truly equitable situation, then you would not see venture funds going to 1%, less than 1% of it, and then having the 99 wanting to hold on to power over that. That's what kills me about the Fearless Fund, and the court systems have fallen right into the whole. We have a level playing field, equal opportunity. We got to be colorblind, we got to be race blind. Otherwise, we're discriminating against majority groups, and that's unfair. And then I'm always like looking around, like left, right, going, but 99% to 1%. And it's not even 1%, it's less than 1%.
Less than 1%.
So,
less than 1%.
And so part of me, Sasha, is where's the common sense in from our perspective? Common sense is contextual, but where's the common sense in these discussions and dialogues that we have with either courts or decision makers? And I'm not sure we'll the people who are bringing these lawsuits, you can't reason common sense with them. That it is a obsession to hold on to moot point, hold on to the power. It is a power hold. It's a power play. It's frustrating because it is so clear as day that. And this is something we haven't talked about yet. It's clear as day that if we create access to everyone, diversity ID&E work is not a zero-sum game. It's not. The pie gets bigger. We get better. We get more creative. We get more innovative. We begin giving people hope who have things to contribute, who aren't blocked. And so as society, everyone does better when everyone does better. Yeah. If that makes sense, right? And so this is the frustrating thing for me is we're not trying to create advantage for certain groups over others. We're trying to create access so that we all can benefit from the beautiful minds that everybody has in order towards creativity and innovation. I know I'm on my soapbox and I'll hop off.
No, I mean, I am 100%, 110% agreeing, right? Because now where my brain is going is like, now this is where capitalism comes in and, and who benefits truly from that. Man, and I know we could go on for like another, 10 days.
Exactly. And I'd be sitting right here talking to you for 10 days. I could do that anytime.
Like, what are the things that you do to take care of yourself? Like, how do you fill your cup and then make sure that you're not stressed the hell out doing this work?
I'm telling you, sometimes it's hard. Because sometimes you just get stressed the hell out because you care so much about this. But what I do quite family is I center on family. I try to do things for my kids. My wife and I are at the point of our lives and fortunate enough to be able to travel a lot. I really fill my cup when I travel and go places where I can, immerse myself in different cultures. I love to be near water. I love to see and just stare out at the ocean and listen to it, or lakes. So my cup gets filled by those kinds of moments and little things like, I'm telling you, I'll make a mistake and listen to a little bit too much news. I'm marching my butt right downstairs and I'm going to do a workout. I'm going to go down and blow out some weights and do some cardio. I like to walk. I love to garden. So I have multiple strategies for filling my cup. And I think it's a wonderful question that you ask, because you can't help others if you're not taking care of your own mental health, your own physical health. And I think it's important. And I don't always do it well. I had, a true vulnerability. I had kind of a crappy day yesterday. And, and if you pulled my wife in here right now, she'd go, he did. And so, but having conversations like this fills my cup. Sasha, you filled my cup, because these kinds of dialogues re-energizes how important the work we're doing. And I know it's difficult, and sometimes we don't see a lot of progress, but it's just when we see a little bit of progress, we help somebody out, we change someone's life, we do something little. We may not change the whole system, but what fills my cup is just helping one person who was blocked and create access. So those are the things that fill my cup. You fill my cup, Sasha. There you
go. Thank you. This show is like my little pebble in the ripple. It's my little ripple. Yes. So hopefully. So if folks wanted to get in contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
So I'm a wide open book, right? So on LinkedIn, you can always, just, look for Eddie Pate on LinkedIn. You can connect with me that way. My email address is just eddiepate21@gmail. I'm wide open for people to do that. I think if you want to find out about my book, and my website for my book is www, and you'll like this, it's www.inclusivepebbles.com. And you can check out my book. If you want to connect in with me, maybe set up some conversations or something, go to Eddie Pate, go to eddie-pate-speaking.com. There you go. And there's a way you can get a hold of me there and see the things that I do. I just reach out, send me an email, and I'll happily sit down and chat with you and talk about, what you're doing. And if you are part of a company or organization and you're looking for speakers, I love to do this. Talk about filling my cup. I love to get in front of people and speak. Bring me in to do a workshop or a keynote, or talk to your executive team or your employee resource groups or whatever. So there are a lot of ways to get a hold of me. You just, not too hard. Not hard at all.
Eddie, thank you so much for spending time and giving us so much to think about. Now I'm thinking about pebbles. I'm like just going to drop pebbles all over the place. So thank you for your time and all those nuggets of knowledge. So I appreciate it.
Sasha, thank you for the opportunity. It's important. Thank you for what you do.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all for tuning into this week's episode. Again, I hope you were able to figure out what your pebbles are going to be, so that you can start making those ripples within your organization. Feel free to share, like, subscribe this with everyone in your circle. You can find us here every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. for a new episode. And until next time, have a good one.